I am thrilled today to be joined by a very, very close friend of mine, someone I deeply admire, one of the most interesting people I have ever known, somebody I trust and love completely, Father Brad Easterbrooks, who is coming to us from Rome. How are you, Father Brad?
Doing great, Steve. It's great to be here.
Well, we're going to have a conversation that goes through your very, very interesting career. But I thought I would start out by sharing this story about you from the John McCain campaign, because before you were a Catholic priest, you were a very, very able and skilled political staffer. And as it came to be, it was August of 2008. And Sarah Palin became the Republican nominee for vice president of the United States. And as things would play out, you and I wound up in Sedona, Arizona, where I had to take over her debate prep. And this was in 2008. And, a lot of people probably today don't realize that 2008, we were still using videotape. Right? It was the pre-digital era. So we recorded this debate prep, and it was horrific beyond any measure of my ability to explain in the English language, a spectacle of incoherence of the highest level. And I said to you, I called you aside and I said, take that tape, destroy that tape. Pull that tape out, cut that tape to pieces, boil it in water, chop it up some more, put it into a Federal Express package and send it to my house, and never lose personal custody of that tape. And that's exactly what you did. And all these years later, I have the Sarah Palin shredded debate tapes from 2008 that you personally microwaved, shredded, and FedEx. And what I'm going to do is, for everyone who appears on the podcast, they're going to get a paperweight, a clear paperweight with some of the shredded tape in the middle of it to commemorate that chapter in American politics. But you have been around presidential candidates, you have been around the Pope, and you have served your country as a naval officer. You were one of the leading defense attorneys in the United States Navy and the Pacific Fleet as Lieutenant Brad Easterbrook, and you still serve in the United States Navy and will ultimately return to active duty service after your parish assignment in San Diego as a chaplain. I think you hope to deploy with the Marines, but an interesting career.
It's been a lengthy career, and as you have recounted there have been a lot of exciting and interesting adventures. I was thinking about it the other day as I was preparing to come on your program here, and that you and I were one of maybe a handful of people, 4 or 5, who were in Sedona, Arizona, for that debate prep, and it was one of those events. I'll let you describe how it went, but I do remember very well that you said this is one of the most important assignments I've ever given you, is to take this tape and send it to me, but destroy it on the way there. And so I did. I sliced it and microwaved it and sent it to you, and I can see that you still have it. But it was one of the greatest honors of my life to work on the McCain campaign. And to be a part of that. I mean, I was very, very young, relatively speaking. I was 23. We celebrated my 24th birthday in Wasilla, Alaska, of all places, in September, and that was actually the September before the full-blown meltdown of the economy and where that went and everything that changed. I was thinking when we first met, I was a White House intern. You were the vice president's communications director, and we were prepping for the Supreme Court justice confirmations. It was the summer of 2005. We were having lunch in the West Wing of the White House. And the world we were discussing at that lunch in 2005 was a completely different world than what we were experiencing in the summer of 2008. So much had changed between '05 and '08. And then if you think about it, between 2008 and today, so much has changed. I obviously took a different path. One was into the Navy and to serve as a Navy judge advocate, as an attorney in the Navy, and then now as a Catholic priest. But we've maintained a friendship over those years, and I'm very thankful for having gotten to know you and to have you as a part of my life experience over these years. A lot has happened, and yet here we are able to have this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's a mutual affection, believe me. Like I said at the beginning, you are a person who, as you go through life's journey, they say the average person will meet 10,000 people over the course of an average life. I suspect that I might be a little bit higher in that, but when you meet that many people over the course of life, you remember the people who stand out, that have high levels of integrity, sense of honor, who are good people, and that was always you. And your life has gone in the direction of service, military service, part of the United States Navy, deployed in the fleet, and also service as a Catholic priest, religious service. But let's start with the naval service. I remember, and I always talk to young people about this. People will come up and they'll say, "Hey, I want to run campaigns. I want to do this, right? I want to get into this field." And depending on where you go, and how elite the school is, right? The kid will be there with the notebook out and tell me what you did in 1997, right? And you try to explain that nothing that I did a generation ago is really helpful for you in charting out your path in life. But we had stayed in touch. You went to law school. You were finishing law school. You called me up, and I remember the conversation we had, and it was about taking the path less traveled in life. You were not enthusiastic after, I think, having worked in the White House, having worked at really and seen it all on a presidential campaign, to go be an associate in a big law firm. And so you did something different. Talk about that.
I had always admired service, and I was always looking for, I guess, the right opportunity to say yes to service in the U.S. military. I never found before this time, I hadn't found what really fit me until the law, and then I realized, well, I could serve in the military and be an attorney, and that seemed to fit me best. I had really found military service to be honorable because of the example of my grandfathers. Both of my grandfathers served during World War II, one as a Navy sailor, and the other as a pilot of P-38s who served missions over Europe, over North Africa and then Europe. And I found both of my grandfathers to have set an example of what we would call in the Navy core values: honor, courage, and commitment. They had a sense of loyalty, a sense of commitment, a sense of an ethical framework to life by which they lived, and by which they set for me a model. And so I always admired service, and I wanted to make that a part of my career path. So I wanted to be an attorney and use my law degree, and I found that the JAG Corps, it's JAG for Judge Advocate General Corps. The JAG Corps was something that was adapted to my talents and to my desires to serve. So I made that application. And one of the things that people don't realize is that it can be very competitive to get into the JAG Corps. So there's a process by which you apply. And I remember that you wrote one of my letters. John McCain wrote one of my letters of recommendation. I ended up being accepted and began my service after law school. First going to San Diego to serve in a capacity as a government attorney. So I was a prosecutor and a counselor to commanding officers of various commands in the region. And then I served after that in San Diego for a couple of years. And then after that, I served for 3 years in Japan as a defense attorney.
And did you like being a defense attorney? You were good at it.
I was good at, I was.
Don't be modest here. You were the what rank defense attorney?
Well, I was named Defense Attorney of the Year for the region of the Pacific. So Japan, Hawaii, and basically the broader Asia region. That put me in competition with about 10 defense attorneys for that region. And I was also, ranked number 1 out of those 10 on 2 occasions during that period.
So you were literally like Lieutenant Caffey from A Few Good. I'm pretty you're just in the Pacific Fleet.
That's a dramatic film, but people ask me if the show JAG's very accurate. I say, actually the show JAG is not very accurate, but then I say The Few Good Men is approaching some accuracy there. And I found it to be quite accurate. There were experiences that I would say were analogous to that show. At times, I had to confront those in authority sometimes with what the law required of them and what the Constitution required. And I found that the role of the defense counsel was very valuable. One of the things that I always thought growing up, and then as I was preparing to be an attorney in law school, was that I could never be a defense attorney. I was government minded, prosecutorial minded, and I was the type who might have asked the question, like, how do you do it? How are you a defense attorney knowing that, this is the popular conception is knowing that your client's guilty. And very often the client is guilty or guilty of something that they've been charged with, but not all the time. And then often they're charged perhaps with too much, or their rights have been violated in some way. And particularly in the military context, but in every context, everyone has a right to a defense. And going back to the Boston Massacre, it's been an honorable profession to serve as defense attorney, because if the rights of the defendant and the accused can be violated, if we modify the rules in one case, if we can prove someone guilty and put them in prison without beyond a reasonable doubt evidence, then we can do it in your case. Then there are going to be people who are innocent or who are suffering from some injustice or some violation of their rights. And that could be you, and that could be me. And so as a society, we've decided that there should be this role, and it's a constitutionally protected role, for an attorney to have a duty that is singularly for the defense of this person. And ultimately, the law is pretty good. We've gone through now hundreds of years of this practice in which we have an adversarial system, and justice is done through that system. But what I found was, if I hadn't been there, or if another defense attorney hadn't been there, there would have been manifest injustice in many cases. And that's not because of malicious intent most of the time. It's just because there's no one looking at the evidence or investigating the case or dealing with the defendant in a way that's mindful of an alternative perspective, or a perspective that is seeking perhaps evidence that it conflicts with the evidence before the court already, but that's given by the prosecution. And so what I found was that the system really does work with an active defense, and the role of defense attorney is very valuable. And I was very honored to have served in that context as well.
And you served in the fleet as well. You were out on an aircraft carrier. You were on the Ronald Reagan for a while.
I had gone underway in the Ronald Reagan. I was never ship's company, but I did serve in that capacity. I was cotted out onto the carrier to do some legal assistance. The ship had to go out faster, I think, than expected. And so some of the paperwork and the powers of attorney, wills, and trusts that the sailors needed for this deployment had not been prepared at the time. And this was years ago. And so they asked me to assist with that. And so I was caught out onto the carrier and did some briefings and helped some sailors who needed those documents prepared. At the time, I was running a legal assistance office on Coronado, which was not a bad job. It was essentially an office for sailors to come in and deal with legal needs that involved their relationship with the community, such as landlord-tenant issues, wills and trust issues, and powers of attorney. So I was situated out there on Coronado in a way where I could easily go out with the carrier, because the Reagan was coming in and out of port in San Diego.
And you talked about the fact that part of your job is to say to a superior officer on occasion, including high-ranking ones, "That's illegal, sir. Right? The Constitution doesn't permit that." Talk about the role of a military lawyer advising a military commander about American law, about the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and about the U.S. Constitution and the obligations of that officer to those things.
Yeah, the military commander is tasked with fulfilling a mission, which means he or she needs his sailors or her sailors to be fully prepared to complete whatever mission that the president gives them or their commanders give them. And that requires people to be ready, requires them to be squared away, requires them to have completed everything that they need to complete to be ready, and the trainings, and to have their uniform ready, and to be where they need to be on time. And in that process, there are going to be those who fail in some way, whether it's due to their own fault or to some other fault. And so often what happens is there's a tension or a conflict between the needs of the mission in a macro perspective and the rights of a sailor if there is suspicion that they've perhaps broken the law in some way, or failed in some way to contribute as they've been tasked to complete the mission. And in that process, they're a sailor who has raised their hand. They've sworn an oath. They've said, "I am going to support and defend the Constitution of the United States." But that same Constitution gives them all of the rights that you and I have as well. Now, some of those rights have to be limited in the military capacity due to the exigencies of military service. But Congress and the Supreme Court and the courts tasked with supporting the military, such as the Navy Marine Corps Appeals Court, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, they've set the rules. And so just as we asked that sailor or that soldier to follow the rules in completing the mission, we also asked that commander or those tasked with administering that mission with following those same rules, including the constitutional rules. And so the role of a staff judge advocate is going to be advising the commander on what his legal obligations are in that context. Now, that I've described the criminal sense of this, where you have a sailor who's suspected of having violated perhaps a criminal code or some sort of regulation. But then there's also ethical requirements, whether or not they're able to give that speech or say this or take that gift, or how they're supposed to interact with a foreign national. And then there are environmental regulations, laws of rules of engagement, and so the staff judge advocate, which is a capacity I served in for a bit, is advising the commander on all of those legal obligations. And generally speaking, they want to follow them. But they also understand that there can be a variance in how they're going to be scrutinized. And so sometimes there can be pressure to get to yes, and sometimes that pressure is responded with a firm position from the attorneys, and they're able to to understand, is this a clear requirement, or is this a requirement that requires their own judgment or their own decision on what types of risks they want to take. In the criminal context, that's where potentially the person is a criminal, and so they need to be dealt with for criminal activity through the constitutional due process that they're afforded. And so it's the job of either that staff judge advocate or that defense attorney to sometimes speak legal truth to the power that is obviously motivated, at least most of the time, by the goodwill of completing the mission.
You used the phrase legal truth,
Mm-hmm.
but you did not stay in that vocation. You found another one in search
Mm-hmm.
of a different type of truth. And I can genuinely say, I'm not often surprised, but I was surprised when you called me. You were about to put on lieutenant commander in the Navy. You had a thriving political career. And tell me about the decision you made next that brings you to Rome and where you wind up in Rome.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I was going up for it, so I would have been considered for promotion that following year, and so that was
You were
where
like
I was.
lieutenant. You were like the Lieutenant Taffy of the Pacific Fleet. So
Exactly.
you're on the edge of being promoted to lieutenant commander, likely, and you do what with your life?
Yeah, well, so to roll back the clock here a little bit on that story, I had been raised sort of as a generic Protestant style Christian growing up. I had been originally baptized a Catholic, but I was raised essentially as a generic Protestant Christian, and that was my general framework. But I went through a conversion process in law school. And so in the middle of law school, while I was actually still preparing to be a Navy judge advocate, I had discovered Catholicism and Catholic Christianity, and basically fell in love with it. So I entered the Catholic Church anew in 2011, 2012. And so when I entered active duty, I did so as a new Catholic, a practicing Catholic, and someone who was very intentional about living out that faith. And so as I was practicing as an attorney in the Navy, I still hadn't come to the conclusion that I was going to become a priest. In fact, I was still seriously dating. I got engaged at one point to another Navy JAG, and she and I had a lengthy relationship, and then we realized we shouldn't get married, so we went separate ways. But then at some point in this process, I started to seriously consider priesthood. And one of the factors that went into that, I viewed what I was doing as a real service. I was serving as an attorney, I was serving the military, but I felt a sense that I had a call to one of the more underlying truths, so to speak, or cultural foundations that I was also being called to serve. And so, in Aristotelian or Aristotle's philosophy, he talks about the various vocations, various professions, and politics is incredibly important to him. I mean, he talks at length. Plato talks at length about politics. Aristotle talks at length about politics, and he describes it as a means to an end. If politics becomes our god, we've disordered something. Politics is a means to obtaining some sort of other reality, and that's basically a peaceful, ordered, just society in which human beings are free to be who they really are, and to live out their identity and their pursuit of happiness, as we'd call it constitutionally in the Declaration of Independence. And so in that environment, what I saw was I think God was calling me to contribute something to one of the underlying foundations that then contributes positively to all of those other paths in life that contribute to the end, which is the success and flourishing of the human person. And one of those things, which I find and continue to find to be foundational, is faith. that my own faith experience allowed me to contribute in a special way. At least this is what I felt called to at the time. And so I considered Catholic priesthood. And as soon as I opened that door, despite all of my initial reluctance, I was reluctant because, as everyone knows, or Catholic priests are celibate. That wasn't actually something I had planned for my life. Another thing is that it's a total vocation. It's not a job. So I know that a Catholic priest never ceases to be, father. So I'm Father Brad, and I could take this off and put on a polo shirt, go out, but I'm still a priest. And so it involves a total commitment. And I was unsure of it, but I as soon as I opened that door, I saw the ways in which God was pointing me in this direction. I saw the ways in which I had clients who I could help with their legal problems. Their rights were violated. I could represent them in court, and we could reach a resolution. But I felt a heart tug to also help with potentially their spiritual problems. They didn't end up in a criminal defense setting out of nowhere. For the most part, they had a full backstory. They had the day after, the day after they're acquitted, or the day after they emerge from prison. There's the rest of their life, and I wanted to contribute in a way that would further those ends or those objectives. And so I gave seminary a chance. In 2017, I left active duty to start seminary. I began in San Diego for 1 year so that I could complete what was a philosophy requirement. I had to essentially major in philosophy and take all the credits that were necessary for a philosophy major to go on to my seminary in Rome. So I did that in 1 year. And then I moved to Rome. And during that 5-year period preceding my ordination to the priesthood, I found that this was indeed the vocation to which I felt called by God, and to which I wanted to say yes. And I had to get to a point where my yes wasn't just a yes to, in a subservient way, follow God's will. I didn't think that's how he wanted me to respond. It had to be a yes that came from my own desire and free choice to be a priest. And I got to that point, and I was ordained a deacon in 2021 in St. Peter's Basilica. And then I was ordained a Catholic priest last June 2022 in San Diego by now Cardinal McElroy.
Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you never miss a video. Also, for more content just like this, please consider joining our Warning Premium community. You can find out more in the description below. I wonder if you might share the story, because I think it is a beautiful story on many levels, as well as being very sad. But the story of your father and your first mass, as you were becoming a priest, your father had a heart attack.
Yeah, about 12 days before my ordination, he had a heart attack. And so I was actually still in Rome at the time, getting ready to fly back for the ordination. And he was in Ohio, and my ordination was gonna be in San Diego. So I dropped everything and flew to Ohio, where he was hospitalized. And he had gone through a surgery and came out of the surgery. The doctors were actually very surprised because apparently when he had gone through the surgery, they didn't know if he was going to make it. He ended up making it through the surgery. And then his recovery was actually proceeding incredibly quickly. And so by the time I got there, which was a day and a half later, because that's about the time it took for me to get a flight and fly across the world, the doctors were very pleased with how things were going, and they were talking about discharge dates. And he continued to recover and gain strength. And so he was fully prepared to watch my ordination on the live stream. And I returned to San Diego to be ordained. And then I was going to return to him when the day after my first mass, and return to him to see him in the hospital, or if he had been discharged at that point, to see him in recovery. A few hours before my ordination began, I found out he had gone into cardiac arrest, which had surprised everyone. And then 15 minutes before the ordination, I was told that it basically was not, he was not going to come through, that they basically wanted to know, should they keep trying to resuscitate? And so they did keep trying to resuscitate. But I proceeded into my ordination knowing my father was dying. And so I was ordained a priest in the midst of my father's death. And it is something that is seared into my memory. You know, a lot of people talk about their ordinations as going very quickly. They don't really remember much of it because so much is going on. There are, you know, thousands of people there, a lot of activity. I remember every detail of my ordination. And I remember very, very vividly experiencing my father's dying during it. And you know what is very, I guess, spiritually very central to this experience for me is this idea that he was my natural father. He brought me into the world as my father, and I was in the process of becoming a spiritual father to a community. And it was as if he had just made it to pass the baton to me, that, you know, though I was becoming a celibate priest who wouldn't be a natural father to anyone, he made it across the finish line to the beginning of my life as a spiritual father. And so that that experience, I think, fundamentally fortified the way I view my priesthood, that I am carrying on a fatherhood in a very special way. And it's a fatherhood that I can experience and offer in a sense that I also received from my own father. You know, my own father was my biggest cheerleader. You know, he was such a supportive man. I mean, he was probably the most excited person on planet Earth for my ordination of the priesthood, probably more excited than me. And yet he was barely able to get there in a living sense. And he wasn't conscious. They played the ordination to him in his hospital room while he was unconscious. And so who knows what he heard. But he lasted a few hours later. And so I received the news at 4:30 a.m. Pacific Coast time. And then my first mass began at, I think it was 9 or 9:30, but I told my family who had arrived for my first mass that he had passed away. They then went in to be seated, and then I proceeded in as Father Brad.
And did your first mass.
And did my first mass and preached the homily, the sermon.
And you will now be leaving Rome after 5 months. You speak Italian fluently. Returning to San Diego, you will be a parish priest for a period of time. And then the plan is that you will return to active military service as a chaplain in the United States Navy. And when last we talked, your ambition was to deploy with Marines.
That's right. So I will be in San Diego for 3 years as a parish priest, and I received that assignment from the cardinal. So I'll be in North County, San Diego. I'll be a parish priest there for 3 years. It's a big, lively parish with thousands of families. And then I will, at the end of that 3-year period, I will be loaned by the Diocese of San Diego to the Archdiocese for the Military Services, who will send me to the military as a Catholic priest and Navy chaplain in the naval service. So that will make me, again, an officer, a chaplain in the Navy, commissioned, swears an oath to the Constitution, and then puts on the uniform and serves as a naval officer. And given the lack of supply of priests, so there are hundreds and hundreds of chaplains in the U.S. Navy. There are about 47 or 48 Catholic priests among those chaplains. And so we're a little underrepresented, and we have something like 25% to a third of the Navy population, depending on where we are and which part of the service. And so because of that shortage, I will primarily be serving overseas at sea and with the Marines for my entire Navy career. Or at least that's my expectation. I mean, there could be some service, through Washington, D.C., but for the most part, I'll be serving in a deployed status. And my ambition is to do that. I want to be with the fleet, and I want to be with the Marines who are, in the most need, because the deployed fleet, the U.S. Marine Corps, are out in a setting where they can't go home. They have they go to a military base or to a bunk, or we call it a rack, in a metal vessel. And so they obviously have recourse, and it's a very good service to have recourse to chaplaincy, to have recourse to a member of their religious faith. And so the chaplaincy includes rabbis, ministers, priests. It includes women ministers, male ministers, and so as a Catholic priest, I'll be able to provide Catholic services. And one of the things that people don't understand, when a military member joins, when he swears the oath, when he commissions or enlists, or she, when he or she joins, their spouse, their kids come with them. And so that sailor overseas in Japan, for instance, has brought their family with them. And they together are in service to the country. Those kids are going often to a Defense Department school. Their dog goes to the veterinarian on the military base. And the Japanese priest down the street, if he exists, doesn't speak English. The minister, he or she down the street, does not speak English. And so the chaplaincy allows a service member to exercise their right to religious liberty, their right to free exercise of religion in the military service. They don't have to hang that up or put that on the shelf for the duration of their military service. They have access to a chaplain, either of their own religious affiliation or of someone who can still support them in a spiritual and counseling sense while they're overseas. And so I will be providing Catholic support to Catholics, so Catholic religious services to Catholics and their families, and then general counseling services and chaplaincy services to every member of every faith group.
We've spent a long time talking about your incredibly fascinating career path, your service, your vocation as a priest, but I want to ask you, as an American who's lived abroad for 5 years, how do you see the country from abroad? What does it look like to you? I was struck recently, Senator from Connecticut, Christopher Murphy, was co-author of a piece, and I'm going to have his writing partner on the podcast, but really talked about that there's a spiritual crisis in the country. And he specifically framed it that there's a spiritual crisis on the left, and that from that position, we need to rehabilitate, reinvigorate from a values perspective, all manner of different notions about how the society functions. But when you look at the country from abroad, when you look at its politics, do you sense a spiritual crisis in America? How do you contextualize the reality of American life through the prism of what is that at any moment, uniquely here, someone somewhere can jump out of a bush with an automatic weapon and mow down 60 people at a school, at a movie theater, at a country music concert? There's certainly been a collapse of faith in American democracy by the political party that we were both affiliated with. almost lock, stock, and barrel. And so I wonder how you think about the collapse of faith at a secular level in our institutions, in our systems, and what the remedy for it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and you bring up a lot of good. There are a lot of questions embedded in that question, and if there were an easy answer, I think we'd have a quick resolution. One thing, and what really liberates me to speak from the macro perspective on this, I think, is, you and I were once affiliated with the Republican Party. As a priest, I'm not really affiliated with any partisan grouping, so I'm able to take a step back and sort of look at the global picture here. And I have been overseas for 8 of the last 9 years, between the military service and then my my seminary and priesthood in Rome. And so when I go back, I see the ways in which things are the same and the ways in which things have changed. And so I experienced, the last few presidential elections overseas, and have seen how things have shifted. One of the things that I would say across the board to the gun issue, I've lived in Japan, I've lived in Italy, I've traveled. I was just in Austria last week. I've traveled all over Europe and other parts of the world. I am never concerned about my physical safety when I'm walking the streets of Rome, even at 1 a.m. I was never concerned about my physical safety when I was walking the streets of Tokyo. And that's not to say that crime doesn't exist or there is no incidence of it, but there is much, much less violent crime in the rest of the world, at least the rest of the developed world. And that is striking, especially when I return home and I'm getting the local news again. I can keep up pretty easily with the national news, but I get the local news when I get back, and I see what's going on. And what I have found is we've had an increase in dramatic violence and an increase of an inability to have a conversation about it. So when I speak to my friends, my family members, my neighbors about what's going on, I find that people are much more invested in a perspective. And that investment has made the conversation more heated and much more difficult. And so, I've had a lot of time to reflect on, what might be the cause of these conflicts. And I think if you look at the development of the country over time, we as Americans have had very high ideals and have really failed at various times to actually live them out. And you look back in the history of the United States, and we describe every man as inherently equal. And then we also had slavery, which was catastrophically in contradiction with our ideals. So, but the point I'm making on that is there were times when we had a general consensus about what is good, what are our values, and then from that consensus, we were able to have arguments and debates. And when we realized that we could no longer have a discussion, there was a civil war. And an approach emerged out of that civil war that got us to where we are today, that fully recognizes, at least in law, and it's still waiting to be implemented, but the fully recognizes, at least in a principled sense, the inherent equal dignity of every human being. And where we are today, I think, is that we have a fundamental disagreement not only over what our values are, but whether or not we can have values, or what is the approach of how we're going to even address these issues. One of the things that was striking several years ago, early on in his papacy, Pope Francis came to the United States, This was back when John Boehner was speaker, and he was invited to the Congress to address the U.S. Congress. And Pope Francis gave a speech that was well received. But he mentioned, I recently reviewed that speech. He mentioned 6 times the common good as the end of politics. That if you are really doing politics right, what you're doing is you're seeking the common good. And I don't think we use that terminology in our political discourse anymore. And the reasons for that is, I think when some people hear the common good, they think immediately of Marxist socialism, which it's not. And when others hear the common good, they think immediately of the imposition, perhaps of another person's moral viewpoints or values on someone else. Really, the common good is the recognition of a shared benefit and communion of people that we all benefit from, and therefore we contribute to. So, for instance, the education of the population is in service of the common good. Not only am I benefited from the fact that I'm educated, but the society is benefited from the fact that I'm educated and others are educated, because we all can make better contributing members of society when we are educated. And so we recognize that we should make sacrifices, in the sense that we're taxed for it, we contribute to it, so that we can ensure all Americans have at least a baseline education. Well, if that shared value is the baseline from which, and the foundation from which, then we have the freedom to make choices in. I can have the freedom to choose where I go to school, or my parents can have the freedom to choose where they send me to school. But what my parents really can't do is choose to keep me an illiterate, uneducated person who can't even do basic arithmetic for the rest of my life. We have decided as a society that that's basically not acceptable. Well, that limits freedom in some ways. So there is an absolute freedom, so to speak, a fundamental right of a parent to educate, or a fundamental right of a parent to raise their child, but not to so harm their child that they leave them entirely uneducated for the rest of their life. At least that's the value system that we all share. And so that's something that at least most Americans, I think, would say, hey, we all can agree on that is a good, and that we should all make sacrifices and contribute to that good. But that breaks down now, I think, across the board. I think that when you're talking about gun rights, we are having an argument in which we don't have those shared values. You have, on the one hand, some who would view that gun rights are absolute and only from the individual perspective, that I as an individual have a right to bear arms. And then others who might be very much opposed to the ownership of guns. And there are certainly people in between, but when you're not coming to it from the perspective of what is contributing best to the benefit of society, in what ways does gun ownership contribute or harm that good of society, the peace of society, the justice in society, et cetera. And from that baseline, from that shared value, how are we going to assess the freedom from which you can make choices in that shared value? Because we don't approach it from the perspective of the common good, we can no longer have a real dialogue. And so it is a zero-sum game of whether or not a state is going to be regulating or not regulating guns, because of what I would call a kind of encampment or a tribalism on the issue. And so certainly as a priest, I have a duty to assist people to use their value system, use the way in which the faith contributes and informs that value system, to then help shape an approach to the common good that doesn't view freedom solely through the lens of individualism, whereas I would agree with the individual rights and the civil rights, but views the exercise of those individual rights and those civil rights within this broader communitarian perspective, in which I'm also assessing how is this How is this good for society? In what way is this contributing to the community? And from that shared agreement, we then can appropriate rights, which are inherent to the human person, but cannot be absolute if we're going to have a peaceful, just place to live.
What's the way to think about this issue? We really have a immigration crisis. I think that everyone who looks at the issue fairly and honestly would agree on that. We have a mass of human misery fleeing for their lives from despotic regimes south of the border, from unbelievable levels of violence, and they are trying to make it in safety to the United States. Not everybody will be let in. People that are trying to get in and do get across, George W. Bush, who we worked for, once tried to conceptualize and contextualize this as, yes, it is a breaking of a law, but for the father or the mother who walks across a desert to provide a better life for their children, it's also an act of love, doing everything they can to keep those children safe. When you look at what's happening, whether it's Governor Abbott dropping people off on Christmas Eve in front of the vice president's residence off of a bus, disoriented, cold, and alone, whether it's Ron DeSantis in the state of Florida flying bewildered people into the state of California and dropping them off, and Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has insinuated, and I think he may be correct, that this meets the statutory definition of kidnapping, which raises a legal question, right? What happens if one state issues a warrant for the arrest of another state's governor, right? So this spirals to a dark place very, very quickly. But, long preamble, but there's a politics of unmistakable cruelty that is most vividly and demonstrably supported by people who call themselves evangelical Christians. Any basic conception of the meaning of Christianity, who Christ was, is obviously antithetical to this. How do you explain that? One. Two, how does that make your job as a spiritual father more difficult? Because it certainly triggers my cynical gene on religion. It pulls like a tractor beam away from some of those broader truths. I have and I know I'm not alone in that reaction, which and I don't know why, right? You turn away from God, you turn away because of man's frailties and fallibility. But how do you think about that? People who take away from this moment of time, well, the religious people are with this guy, and what they're supporting is this cruelty, and therefore now I'm against religion, and it colors their faith.
Okay, so what I would begin with here is the story of the Good Samaritan. So there's a guy who is beaten up and left for dead on the side of the road in the desert as he's transiting from one town to another. And I believe it's a Levitical priest, so a priest of the temple in ancient Jerusalem, walks by, looks at him, and passes. Another religious person walks by and passes. And so this is Jesus's critique of hypocritical religious leadership. So, Jesus is a Jew himself. He's a rabbi himself. And he's criticizing the tendency often of religious leadership to become cynical or hypocritical. And then a Samaritan comes by, and the Samaritan is the one who cleans the wounds and takes the guy to a place where he can stay and recover and pays for it all. Well, it just so happens to be that a Samaritan's a foreigner, and the foreigner is someone that this man who was left for dead on the side of the road would have not had normal interactions with. He would have not been engaged in any type of commerce or interaction with the Samaritan, and it's the Samaritan who ends up helping the man recover. Well, the point of that story is to reorient the perspective of the listener towards the other, the foreigner, and to show the fundamental equality and dignity between each human being, and to take us out of our comfort zones, our own walls of protection, by which we have come up with their other, and so I am not concerned for them. And so it is to get us out of that comfort and recognize the fundamental shared dignity between each person and the shared responsibility that we have towards our neighbor, even if they're a foreigner, a stranger, or someone who we wouldn't regard highly in our social context. And immigration today is probably, on a macro perspective, a broader experience of that story. And so I would agree with you, and Pope Francis would agree with you. It is impossible to be a Christian and not care about the plight of those who are escaping very dangerous, very violent situations and requesting asylum or immigrating this country for various reasons, even if the reason is just to find a better opportunity for their family. And so in that context, multiple things can be true at the same time. We should have, as a country, a system by which we know who enters the country, and a system by which we can secure the country. And at that same time, what can also be true is that we have a duty as the wealthiest nation in the world and as a society to look towards that immigration demand with an eye towards not simply the number or the fact that they are outsiders, but looks at them with a perspective of the human dignity which they have as human beings. And so the kid who is being separated from a family member, well, if you think through it with human eyes, that's heinous. To separate children from family members solely for punitive reasons, or to discourage migration, because that child is a human being. That child is going to be traumatized for the rest of his life or her life. And so in approaching this issue, particularly from a spiritual perspective, particularly from a Catholic perspective, of which, so strongly does Jesus actually demand approaching the foreigner through the lens of viewing the foreigner with eyes towards their humanity, because everyone in our system has been created in the image of God. Or even the book of Amos, to use a Jewish example, or a book from the Hebrew Bible, which constantly reminds those who have means that they have a shared responsibility of caring for those who are impoverished or destitute, etc. And people will be judged in the grand scheme of things, according to the book of Amos, according to Jesus, by how they approached those who were most in need. And that approach, it does not only involve private charity. It includes private charity. And Americans actually are some of the most generous people in the world when it comes to private charity. But it also involves the ordering of society. And so because we are capable of reviewing asylum cases, and because we're capable of absorbing immigration in a time when there is significant disparity between living conditions in the world, we have a duty. If we're a society based on values, a society based on the Christian perspective of how the world is ordered, we have not just the opportunity, but a duty to approach this issue through the lens of looking past the differences and looking towards people as people. And that's going to require us, some cost. But it ultimately contributes to the community because, at the end of the day, for the most part, with the exception of the Native Americans, everyone else was an immigrant at some point and benefited from a community that welcomed them and allowed them to become Americans in the full sense. And that wasn't done perfectly. And we have had a history of issues, especially where there was a lot of immigration, where the society took a while to accept or to tolerate differences. And a great example of that is discrimination against Catholics in parts of the country in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, against Jews in other contexts in the country. And so we've gotten through those pains, but now we have found another way in which I think we have failed to recognize a shared value system by which we can approach this issue and therefore have these conversations. And as a Catholic priest, as someone who has studied the political philosophies of Augustine, of Thomas Aquinas, of Maimonides, who was a Jewish political philosopher and who contributed to this conversation, we've been actually better at approaching these issues before. And so part of what we'll need, I think, and this is something that's necessary, in order to emerge from this, we are going to have to resource and look at where have we been? What is our history? What were those shared values? What were the principles that we can say actually society had and should have again? Because we have accepted immigrants in much more welcoming ways, and we had shared values that was much more, that involved a much greater openness. And it doesn't mean we should have, quote unquote open borders or just let everybody in without any type of discernment or consideration, or that we should allow criminals to enter the country. Of course not. And but to come up with a system that's going to work and be much more humane, we are going to actually have to we are going to have to go down deeper than just winning the next election or getting a party to vanquish an issue. And because that's not going to ultimately resolve the problem. We're going to have to fundamentally return to our most basic principles and decide that we agree that this person, this family, these people are fundamentally human, that they share the same aspirations that we do, that they are deserving of the same fundamental rights that we have. And because of that, I owe something because I have everything and as American. I have all of the opportunities that they might be seeking, and that with a shared cost that everyone can perhaps contribute to, the common good benefits because now I have additional contributors. I have people who've come here to also become a part of the society, and that diversity, when it's done correctly, that diversity can only benefit us.
I've been a longtime believer that really the fundamental issue of our era is the collapse of trust between Americans and institutions. The military is important to understand as an institution because it is the rarest example of an institution that lost trust during the Vietnam War and then recovered trust. It became one of the most trusted institutions in the country. The Catholic Church as an institution has lost trust and broken faith with millions of Catholics, including the one who left the church that you're talking to. How do you think about that from the perspective of wearing the collar now, the impression that many have of a Catholic priest as being a threat potentially to their children? What do you say to those people who have alternately feel betrayed by the church, brokenhearted by the church, that their bonds of trust with the church were broken. As somebody who I genuinely know to be one of the most honorable people I've ever met, who will be a wonderful priest, what do you say to them at an individual level before I tee up Pope Francis's legacy for you?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is I'm in one sense, I'm with you. I am someone who has at various times, as these events have confronted me, been disheartened and felt betrayed by the institutional failures of the church. You know, I went to Boston College, and I started in 2003 in Boston College. So that was right after the peak of the sex abuse crisis in Boston. And as I stated at the beginning of this, I was not a Catholic. I was not a practicing Catholic in the sense of someone who considered myself a Catholic. I didn't identify as a Catholic. And I was at Boston College, which is a Catholic university and a Jesuit university. And I'm there in the wake of the sex abuse crisis, you know, while it's still hot. Well, Cardinal Law, who, you know, was you know, essentially had to resign from the office of Archbishop of Boston because of his institutional failures. And I found that the crisis was enough at that time for me not even to consider becoming Catholic. So I was at Boston College. It was an incredibly incredibly intellectual environment, in part because of the contributions of Jesuit priests, and certainly the contributions of many Catholics who contribute to that university. But I didn't even consider becoming a Catholic while I was there, and it was because of the sex abuse crisis. And you know, I thought through it. I thought, this is so discrediting, I don't have to consider it. What I think I discovered, you know, so over time, as that developed in my own life, first of all, I was able to contextualize it. Okay, so it is a spectacular institutional failure of the Catholic Church for this to have happened, because what it did was it was another example of what tends to be the institutional impulse, whether you're USC, Penn State, the Boy Scouts, the Catholic Church, some public schools. A scandal or a sex abuse crisis comes along, and the institutional impulse immediately is to cover it up. Well, the problem, and that's criminal, and it's criminal in all these cases. But the problem with that is in the Catholic setting. The Catholic Church is claiming a type of moral and spiritual authority. And so what makes it additionally heinous is that people in a position of spiritual authority were letting us down, you and me both as Catholics at the time, or you as a Catholic and then me as a Catholic later, we're letting us down. And so ultimately, when I felt called to the Catholic faith, and when I felt called to become a priest, what was fundamentally calling me was the faith. So Jesus, who is both the origin and the leader of the faith, who was raised from the dead in the Catholic sense of things. And so in my belief that he's raised from the dead and that he is ultimately in charge of the Catholic faith and of my own Christian spirituality, I found him to be true. I found the Beatitudes to be true. You know, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the humble. I found his teaching to be true. And I found the saints, such as Mother Teresa, for instance, to be truly living out the Catholic faith. And then I found that there are institutional actors who have let us down, either from a moral failure or from a general incompetence. And my call to the priesthood fully acknowledges that it is going to be at my own in some settings at my own personal cost, that someone's going to see the collar and they're going to think about what they saw in the news several years ago or decades ago. And that I am being asked to be a priest in that setting with that sacrifice. And that's okay for me because I have come to know the fundamental faith in my own life as being something living and true. And so my own contribution is to participate in the truth of the faith, and in the broader sense, to join with others who are engaged in the effort to reform that which needs to be reformed. You know, when I first got to Rome, as I had transitioned in seminary from San Diego to Rome, I went to Assisi to learn Italian, and I was in a Italian program in Assisi, Italy, where Francis of Assisi was born in the 12th century. And at the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, Francis of Assisi is sitting beneath the San Damiano cross. And that cross, according to the story, speaks to him. And it's Christ speaking to him saying, "Francis, rebuild my church." And so Francis hears that and thinks, rebuild the church building. And so you can still actually visit this stone chapel that he by hand erected and fixed. And so now he's got this nice chapel built, and he goes back to the cross, and the cross again says to him, rebuild my church. And what Francis realizes in that is that he's being asked to rebuild the spiritual church, not the physical church building, but the spiritual church that constitutes all of the members of the church in the world at that time. And so he becomes a type of radical, spiritual figure, someone, we would experience as kind of crazy, kind of out there. He gives up all of his belongings. He even takes his clothes off to make the point, and he stands naked before the bishop talking about his spiritual calling. And ultimately, he wears this brown potato sack, which becomes the habit or the uniform of what is the Franciscan order today, that stems from his religious grouping. But he, in a radical way, represented the poverty of Christ and the poverty of Christianity in order to correct and reform the corruption in the church at that time, and at the turn of the 13th century. And that probably had the effect of reforming and saving the church and making the church a renewed witness to what was most fundamental, and not whatever it was doing at the time, which was related to serious levels of corruption then. And so institutionally, in a worldly sense, there are going to be worldly actors. We have human beings who are sinful, who behave badly, and who are going to occupy the institution. And then there is the fundamental faith that is going to be constantly calling people to reform, to rebuild the church. And in many senses, the saints such as Saint Francis of Assisi and Mother Teresa are in a particularly radical way witnessing to what is most fundamental to the faith, so that that reform process can always be carried out and affected in the life of the church. And that's always going to be a struggle. I was sitting beneath that San Damiano crucifix, thinking about that message while the McCarrick stories were breaking in the news in the summer of 2018. And so I had on the outside of that church the McCarrick news, in which we found out that Cardinal McCarrick had been an abuser himself, and had done so while he was also overseeing a process by which the church had been responding to the abuse crisis. And the church had come up with a charter called the Dallas Charter on dealing with how to deal with all of these cases and to make sure it never happens again. And then it was found out that someone in a very integral way was involved in the process, and he himself had been an abuser, and that was incredibly scandalous. And so beneath that crucifix, I prayed that I would be given the help to contribute, not that I'm going to be a St. Francis of Assisi, but that I will contribute in the way that I can, in the way that I've been called to, again, participate in the rebuilding and the reform of the church, so that the most effective witness of what God is trying to do in the church, and what I experience as a living spiritual dimension to the church, can be effective in the world, and not covered by the institutional problems that have this persistence. And so there is always going to be that reality, and then I am hopefully, and I ask for people's prayers, that I'm always someone who is contributing to the betterment and the reform of the witness of the church, and the reform of the institution for that purpose.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about is Pope Francis's legacy. He has been Pope long enough for it to be firmly established. What is it?
Pope Francis, I think he's one of the most misunderstood popes. He has caused a lot of, a lot of speculation, a lot of opinion. People wondered, is he coming in to change everything? And, now 10 years on, some things have changed and some things haven't. I think the best way to understand him is that he is not someone you can categorize on left and right. And we tend to do that because we have these political minds that try to categorize an approach as left or right, liberal or conservative. And I think one of the reasons why it's hard to understand him is he's neither. He's someone who I would say has a radical theology. And I use the word radical in the root sense. Like a radish is a root. So it means that he's getting back to a fundamental core, and that fundamental core is going to be simultaneously challenging to all individuals, because it's a Christian core, and he's trying to witness to that as Pope. So someone responsible with governing the church, but witnessing to the core, which is the life of Christ, which is one of poverty. And so, even though he didn't have to do this, he's living in a small room in a Vatican hotel it's a hotel for Vatican guests. But he's living there and not living in the papal apartment. The papal apartment, something, that was considered larger and somewhere he didn't want to live. And so he's living in a way that is witnessing to a poverty, because he's trying to help us reflect on a detachment from simply the pursuit of material wealth. And you can apply that across the board. And so when he's talking about women and their involvement in the leadership of the church, on the one hand, he hasn't changed the teaching on women priests. So it's still only men can be priests. But at the same time, he's placing women in leadership positions in the Vatican that they've never held before, positions in which they have responsibility over clergy in other departments of the Vatican. And so, why is he doing that? Because he's getting to a radical core of the teaching of the faith, which isn't necessarily placing him on left or right, or what you might think of as change versus conservatism. But focusing on the human dignity of the person. And if I were to get to what is the principled radical core that he has focused in on as Pope, and it is, I would say, it's the teaching of the Second Vatican Council that we have to unpack further as Christians and as Catholics, and as actually brothers and sisters, no matter what our faith background is across the world, or no background at all, no faith background, but that we share a fundamental human dignity. As Catholics, I believe that, because I believe everyone's created in the image and likeness of God. But in that shared human dignity, I can unpack answers to questions that have emerged in modern society in ways that might shift my perspective or my presuppositions. And so, the course of the church's teaching, for instance, on the death penalty has always been that it was moral, but it should be limited. And he's come out and basically said, given our deeper and more profound understanding of human dignity, we should not use the death penalty anymore at all, and that it's inadmissible in all cases. And that's because he's gone back to the root of what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God, and then applied that root principle to our situation today, in which we have no exigent need as a society who can imprison people to execute someone. And so now applying that today in our context, where we have all the capability in the world to imprison someone safely and keep society safe from them if they're a danger to society, well, we can now say that, well, we should not, in our mercy and in our care for that person as a human being, we shouldn't execute that person. Now, that's going to fundamentally challenge people, because the crimes that are committed might deserve death in a pure sense of justice. They might be, they might call out to heaven based on their evil, that this person should be put to death. But Francis has called us to look back at the core and then apply that core again in a renewed way to these situations. And he's done that, with immigration. He's done that with, I think, our political discourse. He's done that on issues related to the environment. And so he's speaking, I think, to a very broad audience in the world, saying we might not share a theological perspective, but we do share this sense that the human person and the human being matters in a fundamental way. I know I matter, you know you matter, that our actions have ethical consequences, that our actions affect each other. And given that we can discourse on that, even if we might not share a faith background, we can contribute to the community in a way that better reflects the root human dignity that we all share, and that should be reflected in our social interactions and in our politics.
Wise and deep words. Father Brad Easterbrook, thank you for the time. Good luck to you as you come back to San Diego and ultimately back into the military with the United States Marine Corps and U.S. Navy sailors who keep us safe.
Thank you, Steve. It's been great to be on.